Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture, Appraisal, the Heart of Archives. So here are our weekly topics and course objectives for this week. So we'll be addressing all of our core learning objectives, talking about what is appraisal, what are the different ideas about appraisal and its function in archives, looking at some of the challenges of appraisal, and looking at some of the factors that influence which materials are appraised as being worthy of continued preservation. And this last weekly topic especially touches on a lot of the different learning objectives for this course. So obviously, which factors archives consider when making appraisal choices can influence the construction of social memory because it influences which records ultimately survive for the public to interact with. These factors straddle issues such as preservation and digital preservation and arrangement and description. So definitely some connections to other aspects of archival practice. There's a big ethical and social responsibility component to appraisal as well when archivists are thinking about which records ultimately end up in archives. And a lot of the discussions around which factors influence which materials are praised as being worthy of continued preservation are related to our last course objective, especially when we talk about changing ideas about what archives should document. That's really had a big influence on what types of records archives consider to be archival and thus merit continued preservation into the future. So we'll jump into it with a quick definition of appraisal. This is from the Society of American Archivists Glossary of Archival Records and Terminology. I won't read the whole thing. I just want to touch on this idea of identifying materials. So ultimately, that's what appraisal is about. It's identifying materials that have sufficient value to come into archives. And again, this whole idea of what has sufficient value and what does not have sufficient value depends on a lot of factors, many of which we'll touch on in this lecture. This idea of permanent archival value, so the idea that when you appraise things, you're saying that essentially these records have value now and into the foreseeable future. And once we bring them into our archives, at least to a certain degree, we're saying, we're going to preserve these records, into the infinite future. So it's quite a big choice by archives to, say that we're going to accept responsibility for these records, essentially for as long as they exist, or as long as we exist, as long as society exists. So it is a big choice, and ideally one that is made with a lot of justifiable and transparent decisions supporting it. One thing that we'll talk about a fair amount in this lecture, and something that touches on the idea of the continuum record-keeping model, which we talked about last week, is this idea of appraisal taking place prior to donation and prior to physical transfer. So this idea that archivists can work with records creators before the records actually come into the archive to learn more about the records, more about the context surrounding the records, learn about the authenticity of the records, and take that information into consideration when making appraisal choices. And that's something that the Huth chapter for this week is really focused on, this need for, especially in the case of digital record appraisal, for appraisal to take place, ideally as close to the creation of the record as possible, rather than waiting for the records to come into the archive, who knows how long after they've been created or just kind of hanging around. So a couple of quotes from our readings for this week, a couple of our readings, the Huth chapter and the Cook article. So the Huth quote talking about the fact that in some respects appraisal is a science and an art. and its importance in determining everything about archives. And this is echoed in the Cook quote we have here, where Cook talks about how all archival activities sort of flow from this act of appraisal. So appraisal is, as I kind of touched on in the title of this lecture, really the heart of it all. And what happens during appraisal can have a profound impact on how these different activities that archivists carry out in the future. So, if they take place at all, because if an archivist says, no, we're not going to accept these records, and obviously they are going to be processed, preserved, provided access to. And we'll talk about how the degree to which appraisal is carried out can make processes like description, preservation, reference work, online access, outreach much easier. And then again, sort of touching on this idea of appraisal determining which documents are destroyed, excluded from archives, their creators forgotten, effaced from memory, all this done by us, the archivist. So again, just sort of reiterating the centrality of appraisal to archives and the archival processes that we will talk about for the rest of this semester. Okay, so the whole idea of appraisal really goes back to this idea of archives as being fragmentary. So it's very unlikely that archives are going to even have a chance to appraise all of the records about a given person that exist, or all of the records, that a person created in the course of their life that exists, or all the records that an organization created. So, inevitably over time, there's going to be kind of a win-win process where, people throw records out, people, for whatever reason, decide to exclude things from their records or from their organization's records. And so archives are sort of asked to look at these kind of fragments of memory, fragments of information that remain, and decide if these fragments are archival or not, if they have this permanent archival value that I just talked about, or if they should just kind of be, left to rot somewhere. And some things that archives can keep in mind when carrying out appraisal are some of the things that I talked about in week 1 that make particular fragments more valuable than others. So, fragments that reflect important acts, are easy to access and use, represent activities factually, and so on. These are just sort of general considerations that archives can make when deciding if the fragments of memory, fragments of information that they are praising are actually worthy of continued archival preservation. And obviously, as an archive, you want to collect the most valuable fragments that you can, right? If you bring records, if you bring fragments into your repository that don't meet some of these criteria, that maybe don't reflect the most important parts of a person's life or an organization's activities, that don't document a variety of perspectives and maybe just document one perspective, then that's sort of taking up space and resources that other records, which might be more important and more valuable, may not be able to take. So, again, when you take an archival fragment into care, when you appraise it and say, yes, this is worthy, that implies that at least to some degree, you are going to use resources to arrange and describe these records. You are going to use resources to preserve these records. You are going to use resources to make these records more accessible to varying degrees. And obviously, if you do that for records that are important, then that can detract from an archive's ability to do those things, maybe to a greater degree, to records that maybe do have value and are important for society and for a community. So there's definitely an opportunity cost associated with appraisal and with bringing in certain records into your repository. And again, that kind of speaks to the importance and centrality of appraisal, because you don't want to bring in a bunch of junk that just kind of consumes resources and isn't providing a lot of benefit to your archive or to your researchers. And so again, here are just some general considerations that archivists might make when making appraisal choices. So again, to kind of talk about the basic process that is associated with archives. So this idea that a bunch of records form a collection, and then that collection is used to create some kind of product, and ultimately that product has some kind of consumption attached to it. So whether it is an article that someone is reading that's based off of archival work, a documentary, or so on. So the fragments that archives do collect and do appraise as being valuable are ones that can be brought into society and shared and used in one form or another, ideally. And so again, it's just important that archives realize that the information that they bring into their archives is going to shape people that are consuming either the records themselves or the products that the use of records contribute to, and then that can really influence how people view a particular person, event, organization, and so on. Okay, so just to review this life cycle of the record that we've talked about. So we have this act of creation, use by creator, retention or disposal, appraisal / acquisition by the archive, and then, as we touched on, the subsequent archival activities that flow from this appraisal process. So it's important to consider the overlap or the similarities between this retention or disposal choice by the creator of the records as being analogous in a lot of ways to appraisal choices the archivists make. So at this point, the records creator is saying, okay, I think that these records have value for whatever reason, so we're going to keep them instead of just shredding them. Maybe we're legally required to keep them. Maybe they provide insights into our activities as an organization that are valuable. Whatever compels this retention choice, again, there can be a variety of things. And if there isn't a reason to retain records, then typically they'll be disposed of. And that's similar with archival appraisal. So archives will say, yes, we want to take these records. We think that they have sufficient archival value, and so they'll sort of survive to undergo these archival processes in the future, or they'll say, no, we don't want these. We're either going to give them back, or we have permission to destroy them, or whatever disposal choice in activity is taken. So just some connections to choices made by records creators to retain or dispose, and choices made by archivists in a lot of instances to retain or dispose as well. Sometimes if archives say, no, we're not going to accept these records, then that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be destroyed by the person that created them. But there's a high likelihood that if they don't go to archives, then they might end up in the trash somewhere if someone doesn't really want to go to the trouble of trying to find another home to them. So it can be kind of a life or death choice that archives are making. So this also goes back to this idea of our ingredients phase. And if records are disposed of by records creators, if archivists decide not to acquire records, then these ingredients don't survive into the future for researchers to use, and that can really impact the archival meal the archivists serve to our researchers in the future. Because again, if records are disposed of, then obviously these sort of subsequent processes of access, arrangement, description, reference, and so on don't take place. And again, this information may survive somewhere. It may just be in someone's basement or whatever. So, there are instances where the records might be available for researchers to still find and use, but it's going to be a lot more difficult, and the records won't be nearly as accessible as they might be if they end up in an archive, because again, these kind of subsequent processes don't take place, at least at an archival kind of level. And, essentially, if not literally, the information contained in records that aren't brought into archives can be lost. So let's talk about some of the challenges of appraisal now that we've talked about appraisal and some of the different characteristics and considerations related to it. So complexity, this is something that the Huth article talked about. There can be records scattered all over, a person's personal computers or an organization's computers, external hard drives, mobile drives, cloud storage and email services. And so archivists have to not only locate that information, but sort of decide what is the best representation of that information to bring into a repository. Being able to get a really clear picture on a person's activities can be difficult enough, but when you think about an organization like a large bureaucracy, like a university, in the case of the Robbins and Willman article for this week, just understanding what an organization is doing and what its different functions are can be really difficult, and it can be a pretty complex process. With that is this idea of expense. So, you need the resources to be able to carry out appraisal in a sufficient and thorough manner. So, if you sort of embrace this embedded archivist that the Huth chapter advocates for, are you really going to have an archivist who can dedicate, X number of hours a week just to learning about the records of one company? Archives typically don't have that kind of resources just sort of laying around. So appraisal can be a very complex process, and one that archives may not have a ton of resources to donate to. And as we'll talk about later, you can see that reflected in a lot of the appraisal practices of a lot of archives. And then this idea of importance, which we've already talked about. So this idea that if records are not brought into an archive, then they may be destroyed. At the very least, they'll probably be incredibly difficult for people to know about and actually access and use. And so that can result in voices that are lost, to history, and perspectives that are lost and not represented in archives and not available for subsequent researchers to use and interact with, for whatever reason. And Cook argues that this really suggests that archives have an ethical need to define and carry out appraisal in transparent and defensible ways. So because of this importance, it really is necessary for archives to demonstrate what their appraisal choices are, to be able to defend the appraisal choices that they're making. And at least ideally, that will lead to more of an objective perspective by archives about what they consider important enough to bring into an archive. And then we also have this idea of sustainability. So obviously related to expense, you have to be able to have appraisal processes that your archives can sort of sustain over the long run, and ones that aren't going to gobble up all of your archives resources. So maybe you're able to do appraisal well, but are you still able to do all the other things that your archive is being asked to carry out? And another part of appraisal is taking into consideration how sustainable it's going to be for your archives to actually care for the records that you are appraising in the future. So not only do you have to have the ability to carry out appraisal in a sustainable way, but you have to think of the sustainability of your archive as a whole when you are making appraisal choices. And we'll talk about this more in just a little bit. Another challenge of appraisal can be a lack of participation by records creators. So if a situation takes place where archives are not able to work with records creators for whatever reason, that can really impact their ability to understand the content and context of records, and it can really undermine the ability of archives to make informed appraisal choices. So if you don't know what something is and you don't know why it was created or who created it or what it was used for, then that can make it really difficult for you to determine if something has sufficient archival value. And if you're not able to work with records creators, either because they're they're dead, or they're just not interested in working with you as an archivist, or they're on a beach somewhere, then it can really be difficult to get a grasp of that content and contextual information. And so again, that's something that the Huth chapter for this week really focuses on, this need to have a relationship with records creators. The Robinson-Woolman article talks about it as well, in order for informed and defensible appraisal decisions to be made. So some of the things that appraisal determines: which copy of a record is the most authentic. So which copy of a record, because there may be a lot of them, is really the most valuable or the most definitive record to bring into a repository. Say 3 people get a letter, but one of them kind of makes annotations in a corner that provides additional information about the contents of the letter. Maybe that makes that letter sort of more definitive than the other copies. And making this determination can be a pretty complex thing for archives to do, again, if they aren't working with the creators of these records. Thinking about how and if the record will be transferred and used. So which format will the record be transferred and retained in? Maybe it won't be retained at all, and the creator will maintain control of the record, and the archives will direct researchers to them. So when you think about authenticity, ideally archives are transferring records in the formats that they're created in, but that may not be possible. So that's kind of another consideration that archivists need to make as well. Another one is thinking about how the records are or should be arranged. So is there an original order that you are planning on maintaining? Is it an instance where, as an archivist, you're going to have to spend a ton of time arranging and describing the records because maybe they're just thrown in a box somewhere, and you realize it's going to take a lot of effort just to create an arrangement and description that is going to be useful for researchers. So those are considerations that archivists need to make as well. And this kind of goes back to this idea of sustainability. If you have 1,000 cubic feet of records and they're just like a mess and there's no sort of discernible order to them, then you have to think, do we as an archive really have the resources to arrange and describe these records, or is it kind of beyond our capabilities? And also how the records can be preserved. So, are the records in such poor shape that we couldn't possibly preserve them in the long run or even make them safe for researchers to use? Maybe they've been in a basement for a decade and there's mold growing all over them. If that's the case, then an archivist should say, well, we're not really sure that we can provide access to these records, in a safe way. Or maybe the records are in a format that the archives just doesn't have the capability to uh, to allow researchers to access. So again, it just kind of goes back to this idea of sustainability. Can the archive sustainably provide access to records, and relating that thought to the condition or format that records are in? And lastly, how and if the records will be accessed. So, are the records going to be pretty easy to access and understand because there's appropriate metadata attached to them? Does a researcher want to, slap a 75-year restriction on these records before anyone even sees them? These are additional considerations that archives should make as well. It's not going to do a whole lot of good for your archives to, bring in collection after collection that it's going to, be a long, long time before the records are accessible for whatever reason, whether it's because, there's poor metadata associated with them or because researchers want to restrict them until the sun doesn't shine. And it's going to be, potentially decades before a researcher even can access them and look at them. Okay, so a few things that appraisal should avoid: collecting flavors of the week records exclusively. This is something that the Cook article touches on. Ideally, archives aren't kind of weather vanes that sort of blow whatever the winds of academic interest and societal interests are blowing, because that can result in archives not really thinking about the big picture and what might in the long run be in the best interest of society for archives to collect. Archives are maybe enticed to look at old things as being valuable, even if they aren't really that useful. So, if you come across a letter from the 1860s, you might be like, wow, this is old, it has that kind of old paper smell to it. And gosh, it just has to be important. But if it's just, a pay stub for someone and it doesn't really provide a whole lot of valuable information, then it's pretty questionable if you should bring that into your repository or just say thanks but no thanks. And finally, collecting based on simply knowing that records are archival. So again, there should be a process where archives are supporting their work, where they are getting an understanding of the real context and content behind records and demonstrating that records are archival, and not just sort of going on intuition and your gut feeling that something actually is valuable. And these can be pretty easy traps to fall into as an archivist. Okay, so next we'll talk about some of the phases of appraisal development that the Cook article discusses. So we have the first phase, the Jenkinsonian phase, and the idea in this phase was that archivists should have no mediative role in appraising records, and that all the power of determining which records are valuable or not falls with the creator or custodian of a record before it comes into archival care. So essentially, archivists should have no intervention with the records until the records come into the archive. And this sort of relates to the traditional notion of archives as being natural or organic, and archives as being neutral and objective. And, essentially it's a condition where, as Huth notes, the survival or destruction decisions by the original creator or custodian are not questioned. And Cook describes this as archival collusion with power, basically saying that the elites in society, the people that are creating the records, should have, the foremost role in determining which information survives into the future. And he's essentially saying that if archives kind of endorse this perspective and don't try and intervene to at least encourage certain records to be kept and certain perspectives to be available to researchers in the future, then archives are colluding with power and they're not meeting their ethical and social responsibilities. So next we have our second phase, which is one that is associated with Schellenberg. Schellenberg and Jenkinson hated each other. Schellenberg described Jenkinson as a fossil. Jenkinson described Schellenberg's ideas as, dangerous. So definitely a lot of conflict between these two different perspectives of appraisal. So Schellenberg was really interested in broadening interest to less traditional subjects. And there was a lot of rejection of Jenkinsonian ideas. So there was more of a recognition that archives should have some role in shaping which records ultimately come into archives. So this second phase, as Cook describes, really is the first shift towards considering archives as a broader part of a process of narrative remembering and forgetting, and not just this kind of body focused on solely preserving evidential information. And this phase began to see the first glimmers of archives feeling more of a need in shaping what archives ultimately look like through their appraisal choices. So you can associate this with our fifth course learning objective, which talks about sort of a shift in ideas about what archives should document. You kind of see the first glimmers of that in this second phase. Then we have this third phase, so macro appraisal, really inspired by efforts to reflect values and trends of society during record creation and translating them into appraisal and research methodologies. And this phase of appraisal determined archival value by reflecting society's values through citizen interactions with the state. So it was an appraisal kind of paradigm really focused on documenting the interactions between the state and citizens and having a balance of institutional and personal perspectives with a special focus on the marginalized in society. So here we see an even greater shift towards this idea that archives should intervene and they should make appraisal choices that document people in society that have been marginalized and how these people interact with sort of what has been typically considered to be the elites in society. So kind of having more of a balanced perspective instead of just a perspective of the elites in society, which is typically the one that survived or was more likely to survive in Jenkinson's views of what archival appraisal should look like. And finally, we have this idea of total archives. So archives document societal functions poorly documented through institutional records. So really focusing on the appraisal of personal and private records in varied formats and perspectives, really focusing on co-appraisal with members of society. And in this role, archives would serve as more of appraisal mentors, coaches, and partners. And there's a big focus on personal archives, balancing the perspective of corporate and organizational archives. So a strong shift away from archives kind of being this powerless, just sort of acceptor, to one where archives are sharing their power, but they're also doing so by facilitating the perspectives of people kind of outside of the elites of society. And this fourth phase really reflects on the idea of appraisal as an ethical responsibility that archives have to reclaim power from records creators, to ensure that adequate information is collected, both in the form of records and about records, and that as many voices and perspectives as possible are preserved by archivists and their allies. And so these third phases and the third phase and the fourth phase are a strong shift towards this idea of archives documenting society from the bottom up instead of from the top down. And that archives really should be focusing their appraisal choices on, documenting the experiences and perspectives of people in society that to a great degree were underrepresented through the first phase of appraisal and the second phase as well. So with appraisal, it's important to make a differentiation between what is good and what is possible. And when you think about things like macro appraisal and this idea of total archives, they sound great and they sound like a really positive way for archives to kind of cast a wide net as far as what's considered archival. But they're also very complex processes and very resource heavy processes. And that really limits the ability of archives to kind of effectively engage in these kinds of appraisal practices. And oftentimes what you'll see is most archives still kind of stuck in this first phase where they don't really have time to interact with records creators prior to records coming into the archive. And they just kind of take what they're given. And it's not necessarily because archives want to do that, it's because archives have to do that because of the lack of resources. And again, that's just sort of the sustainable way that a lot of archives can carry out appraisal. Maybe in certain circumstances, archives focus more on appraisal and are able to, have a more evolved appraisal sort of perspective, when it comes to certain topics or certain individuals. But oftentimes, archives are really only able to carry out appraisal on a pretty basic level, which is unfortunate, but it's the truth. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a reason for archives to try and conduct appraisal as thoroughly as possible. If you think about the difference between appraisal done well and appraisal not done well, they can paint two really different pictures, and how appraisal is carried out can distort the view of a person or an event and organization the society has. So if appraisal is done really well, if this sort of total archives perspective is one that's brought to bear as much as possible, then you might have an accurate and reflective view of what society looked like. If you're only able to carry out appraisal on a pretty basic and primitive level, if you're not really able to understand the content and context behind records in a meaningful way, if you're not able to collect perspectives that really reflect the diversity and complexity of society, then the view of society that your archives is portraying might be something that is really false and artificial, and that's sort of the view that you are sharing with society. And again, that can have a lot of implications as far as how society views itself, how society views certain people within society, and it it at best it's confusing, and at worst it can be really harmful. So again, it just speaks to the importance of embracing embracing appraisal and putting as much resources into appraisal as you can as an archive, and trying to do the best with what you have, essentially. Okay, so to talk a little bit more about the actual process of appraisal, here are some questions that an archive might ask during an appraisal. I have, what does an organization do? You could, say, what does a person do, or what did a person do? How do they do it? Which records illustrate these activities? And which of those records are valuable? And so these are some kind of guiding questions that you should be asking when you are carrying out archival appraisals. So what are the important things that an organization carries out? How do they go about doing it? Which records really illustrate how an organization went about doing that, and sort of which of those records are the most valuable to bring into a repository? And so obviously the best way to answer these questions is through working with records creators, right? Because they're the ones that really have the best understanding of what an organization does and sort of the processes that went into that and the records used to support those processes. And that's why in the Robbins and Woolman article, they touch on not only reading administrative histories, but actually interviewing people in different offices. That's why, again, the Huth article really focuses on this idea of understanding a record in context, understanding the processes that creates records, the processes that records support. And so, all these things are important to be able to answer if you want to have appraisal that is as accurate and defensible as possible. Another way to look at the archival process is to consider the archive's mission. So oftentimes this is the starting point. It's the mission of our archive to document X, Y, and Z. And then you start thinking about, okay, well, which potential donors have records that support our mission? And then once you have identified these donors, and ideally you're doing that as soon as possible so that they don't die or retire or whatever, then you start having this relationship with donors where you're starting to think, okay, what was the important things that you did? What were the important things that your organization carried out? And then you kind of go through the process of winnowing it down by IDing specific records, and then sort of continuing to work with donors to gather information about records. So this is kind of another representation of steps that archives can take to carry out appraisal, again, in a meaningful and defensible way, one that is going to result in as much content and contextual information being available to the archive and subsequently to the researcher as possible. And as I touched on before, appraisal can have a lot of benefits when it comes to different processes that archives carry out. So if you carry out appraisal in a thorough manner, if you do kind of go through the processes and questions I just talked about, it's going to help you provide basic access for your records kind of right off the bat. It's really going to help you have notes that you can refer to when you're describing what an organization did or what a person did. It's going to provide you with a lot of information that your reference archivists can use when they are answering questions from researchers. If you think about things like preservation, if you get a lot of preservation information about records, if you know what format they're in, if you know kind of the conditions they've been kept in, then that can help you preserve them better in the future. So it really goes back to this idea of appraisal as being kind of the heart of it all. And appraisal can be expensive, it can be resource intensive, but ultimately, if it's done well, it can save you time and money down the road because you don't have to put as much effort into carrying out subsequent processes as you would if you were bringing in records that you don't really know anything about, that might be in poor condition, and you have to kind of go back and recreate the wheel. In a lot of ways, appraisal can be broken down into a few different phases. So appraisal for acquisition, appraisal for selection, and finally the accepted record. So appraisal for acquisition is when you are identifying appropriate bodies for archival material to add to archival holdings. So you're saying, this is sort of the records that we think match our archive's mission. These are the records that we think that we want to appraise, and just kind of having a basic sort of list of records that may fit in well with your archive. So again, there should be a lot of connection between the records that you're considering and your archive's mission, your archive's collection development policy, and other kind of appraisal policies that your repository has developed. Next, we have appraisal for selection, which is where you have this sort of set of records, this collection that you have decided is a good match for your archive's mission, for your institution's mission, and now you're looking at a collection of records and you're saying, okay, so which of this collection of records, which of the sort of massive records from the organization that we've decided during our appraisal for acquisition is a good fit, are we ultimately going to bring into our repository? And so we'll talk about some of the criteria used for appraisal for selection in just a little bit. And finally, once you've really winnowed things down, you have the accepted records that you decide you want to bring into a repository. So again, in a lot of ways, it's a process of fragmentation, it's a process of elimination. And ideally, your accepted records are going to be the ones that, again, really have this rich contextual and content information, really meet the goals of your institution, and are the ones that you think are important enough to preserve into the infinite future. The Huth article also notes that accepted records may be given an additional sort of layer of technical appraisal if records are determined to be archival and technically complex. So even after you have accepted records and said, yes, we want to bring these into our archives, with digital records, you might have kind of this additional process where you say, all right, so which of these are we really capable of providing access to? Which of these do we have the technical infrastructure in place to make available to our researchers? So some of the appraisal for acquisition criteria, again, relevance to archive's mission, some politics of acquisition. So maybe someone wants to donate records to your archive and they're not a great match to your mission, but they're a donor or an influential person that you want to please or keep happy. You might kind of bite the bullet and say, all right, these aren't a great match for our archives, but we'd really like to have a good relationship with this person, so we're going to bring them into our repository anyway. This idea of thinking about voices and perspectives missing from existing holdings. So if you are in a community that has groups that aren't well represented within your archives, that might be something that you consider during this appraisal for acquisition phase as well, and kind of keep that in mind and keep that into consideration. And again, this goes back to this idea of changing ideas about what archives should document to call back to one of our course learning objectives. And finally, this idea of intrinsic value, that there are different characteristics about records that that are sort of worthy of being appraised on. So like a connection to a famous person, aesthetic qualities, maybe like a rarity of format. If you look at the discussion about intrinsic value that Huth has on page 29. A lot of these intrinsic values can be pretty subjective, but it might be something that archives can consider from time to time. Okay, then with appraisal for selection, the total cost of ownership, again, how much is it going to cost for us to actually take care of these records and provide access to them? And are we kind of capable of meeting that cost? Related to that, the physical condition, if the records are in really bad shape, then that's going to be a consideration. The volume of materials, so as the Cook article talks about, just the mass of records being created by society was something that really spurred the development of appraisal strategy, including functional analysis, which we'll touch on in just a minute. If you're an archive that doesn't have a lot of storage space and you're looking at a collection that has 1,000 cubic feet, you have to keep that in mind when you're deciding whether or not to bring a collection into your repository. The different media that the records are on. So if it's media that it's going to be really difficult for your archives to take care of, or difficult for your archives to provide access to, maybe it's on 8mm film and you don't have an 8mm film projector and you don't really have a way to transfer it to, something else, then that should be a consideration as well. And sort of related to that is the overall accessibility of the records. So are they in a state when you bring them into the archives where they are pretty accessible, or is it going to take a ton of work just for you to be able to even get them in front of researchers? And are you capable of putting in the effort that's going to be required for the records to be accessible? And also potential use. So archivists like to put on their or look into their crystal ball and think, well, are these records going to be useful to people that typically come to our repository, or do we think that there isn't going to be a whole lot of demand for these records? This can be something that's difficult to make a good determination. I guess if you have related collections and people are using the bejesus out of them, then you can kind of justify it that way. But archives aren't clairvoyant. We aren't able to predict the future, and so this is maybe not the best criteria to use when making appraisal choices. And a big, so we also have, intrinsic value, which can play into appraisal for selection as well. So, maybe you have records that, for whatever reason, meet this intrinsic value criteria, and you decide that that's something that you want to consider as well. So, contextual information, again, is just so big. Having the who, what, where, when, and why that really provides you with an understanding of records and what the record is, as opposed to just having the content. And that's something that you should consider during the appraisal for selection criteria as well. So just how much do you know about the records that you're looking at, and how well are you able to convey that information to researchers? So again, ideally, there is a big overlap between the records that you're selecting for your archive and the ability of your archives to actually provide access to those records. If there's a big gap between these two, and records are just going to sit on your shelves and kind of, decay into nothing before they're actually available to the public, then maybe these records aren't the best fit for your archive. So again, you have to kind of consider some of the different criteria for selection that we talked about. So just like the mass of records, the condition that the records are in, the media that the records are on, and really decide, how well the records that you want to bring into your archive meet the ability of your archives to actually take care of them and make them accessible. So next we'll talk about functional analysis for a little bit, and you can place functional analysis, which the Robbins and Woolman article talks about, within the appraisal for acquisition phase. So where you're looking at collections and you're saying, you know, how well do these meet the needs and mission of our repository? So just kind of review, functional analysis is really focused on the idea of looking at the different functions in that an organization carries out or that a person carries out, and deciding which functions are most important, and maybe also considering sub-functions as well, and kind of ranking them and saying, well, we feel like these functions are the most important, so these are the ones that we're going to focus our efforts on, and that we're going to try and spend a lot of time knowing more about in order to make a determination about whether or not to bring these records into our repository. So in the Robbins and Woolman article, one of the functions that they decided that their university was carrying out was recruitment and retention. And then they also felt that this function could be broken down into student admission, registration, and student welfare. So then they would say, okay, well, which one of these are the most important? If we had to say, you know, this is the most important, this is the next important, and this is the third most important, then functional analysis would say, okay, well, let's really focus on collecting records related to student welfare and not really worrying so much about registration or student admission. So functional analysis can be a great way to provide a set of priorities for records to bring into your repository, essentially. And of course, determining what these functions are, what these sub-functions are, can take a lot of work. It can take a lot of research, which the Robbins and Woolman article touches on. You know, reading administrative histories, talking with records creators, talking with people working in offices, just working to get people to even listen to them and talk to them. It seems like was a big effort, kind of depending on the different offices that they were talking to. So that's definitely one difficulty associated with carrying out this appraisal strategy. One of the sort of negatives associated with functional analysis is that it can still be kind of a subjective process. Like maybe one person would say, okay, well, I think that registration is what is the most important sub-function of a university's recruitment and retention efforts, and the other two sub-functions are really important. So you have to be able to support why you think that a particular function or sub-function is the most important one for an archive to focus on and seek to collect. And to go back to the challenges of functional analysis, you know, organizations might be so complex, and different tasks carried out by an organization might be kind of distributed across different departments or different, you know, maybe even contractors, that it can be difficult to determine exactly what sort of concrete functions an organization engages with in the first place, and also who is responsible to carry out the different functions that an organization actually does. So again, this is a pretty complex form of appraisal, one that can require a lot of effort, you know, a lot of research, a lot of time interviewing, and that's definitely a factor, or I guess different factors that make functional analysis more difficult for some archives to carry out, for sure. But I would argue that it is at least a reasonably informed and researched way for appraisal to be carried out, and it does provide at least some kind of reasonably objective criteria for archivists to work with, rather than just kind of going on, gut feeling or intuition, or kind of less supportable and defensible processes. So anyway, once you have decided which functions or subfunctions to focus on, that's when you start looking at which records really illustrate the important aspects of a particular function. So we're saying student welfare is the function that we're really going to work with. So which records really support the student welfare functions of a university? And then again, kind of winnowing things down even more and saying, okay, so which of these records are really the important ones that we want to focus on bringing into our repository? So again, it's this sort of process of elimination. You are choosing specific functions to focus on. You are choosing specific sets of records to focus on. And then you are choosing, even within that, records that really, really illustrate the important aspects of the function that you're trying to document. And so again, that kind of speaks to the different challenges of appraisal. We talked about the complexity of functional analysis. It can be expensive, again, because of the complex nature and the resource-intensive nature. But it can be a form of appraisal that is defensible, and if you're sort of documenting your choices about why you chose what you did, then it can be one that is can be fairly transparent and fairly well supported. And again, functional analysis can really be hindered by lack of participation by records creators. So if people don't want to be interviewed by, archivists that are, asking them to take time out of their day, then that can make finding out what these different functions are and which records support these functions difficult, to say the least. So we can connect appraisal to the different ideas of co-creatorship that we've talked about. So people that create records can impact appraisal choices. If they decide to get rid of something, then obviously it's not going to survive for archivists to appraise in the future. If they don't record contextual information about the records that they create, then that can limit the ability of archives to appraise records as well. I have a lot of stuff in my personal archives that I look at it, I'm like, well, gosh, I know that this is a picture, I know the content, but I don't really know like why I took it or what was going on at this time. And so because I didn't bother to, record that information, somehow it can really detract from the potential value of these records as archival in the future. Communities might be good resources for helping archives determine if records are important or not. So if you aren't sure what records that a community created are really representative of the community or of the community's history, then you can definitely consult with them to get that information and help you along with your appraisal choices. It may be that the community, for whatever reason, doesn't want to see records end up in archives, so they sort of say, this is something that just belongs to the community. We don't want these to be available to archives. That can impact the appraisal choices that an archive is able to make as well. Creation by custodians, this is a big one. Maybe 10 years down the road, or hopefully longer than that, if I'm dead and gone, my daughters or maybe their children, look at some of my personal archives and they're like, "Ooh, we're not really sure that we want that sort of private information to wind up in an archive, so we're going to get rid of it." And obviously, that can impact the appraisal choices that an archive has the potential to make as well. We've talked about how appraisal is a creative or, in a lot of ways, destructive act by archives. By appraising records and making the decision they are archival. As Cook notes, really, that is a creative act. We're sort of elevating records and saying, yes, these are archival. And it's also to think of how activators and researchers can influence appraisal choices. So if people are researching with records and maybe they come across some really important information, if they're using a particular collection or collections related to a particular topic, then that may influence archives to try and seek out more records related to a person or to a topic. And, as we noted, that's not really the best way to carry out appraisal, but it's certainly a possibility. And, that can have a role in shaping which information survives into the future for researchers to be able to use. Okay, we'll talk just a little bit about digital records and appraisal, which is what the Huth chapter is really focused on. And this is obviously strongly connected with the changing nature of records, another part of our fifth course learning objective. These discussions about the complexities involved with preserving digital records would not be an issue if the nature of records hadn't changed over time into their current predominantly digital nature. So appraising digital records can be difficult because there's a layer of technology between the record and the appraiser. So if you want to appraise someone's personal archives, then a lot of their archives are on hard drives. Obviously you need to interact with the hard drive in order to access that information. So it just kind of creates another barrier between the record and the ability of the archives to actually see, the content and context of a particular set of records. And it may be that a hard drive is corrupted or whatever, and that's a barrier that can't be overcome, and then the records are probably lost for good, which is obviously unfortunate. As Huth talks about a lot, ideally this appraisal begins at the act of conception or creation. Again, so archives can make sure that they're getting a good understanding of the content and context of records. They're understanding even the software or programs that created records so that they can know what kind of information is being attached to records or not attached to records. This idea of the embedded archivist, probably a great idea, maybe one that's not necessarily practical for most archives. And Huth talks about the difficulty of appraising digital records once they're no longer being used. So if there is a gap of time between when the records are being used and created and when archivists are working with them, that can have an impact on the ability of an archives to view the records. Maybe for whatever reason the context has been detached from the records. Maybe the media that the records are stored on is decayed. There are a lot of things that can happen once records stop being used, and that can impact the ability of archives to appraise, especially digital records. Huth also promotes this idea of working with creators or potential donors of archives throughout the life of the record. So again, not waiting for records to end up in an archive, 30 years after they're created and used, but having a strong relationship and collaboration throughout the entire life of the record. That brings us back to this idea of the continuum model. So the idea that appraisal doesn't take place just once, but that ideally it's carried out by archives throughout the entire life cycle of the record. So from the moment of creation on, and even to the indefinite future, once records are in archives. There's a lot of truth to the idea that appraisal in archives continues on, into the indefinite future. And archives constantly make value judgments about archives or about records, how useful records are, the value of records. And we'll talk a lot about these value judgments as we move through these different processes that archives engage in. But they really can impact how well or how able researchers are able to access records, how well researchers are able to understand records, and that can have a lot of impact on social memory, because if you aren't able to access a record, or if you aren't able to really understand the content and context behind records, then that may make it less likely that you're going to actually use records, and that can result in sort of holes or silences or marginalized voices within social memory. And again, we'll talk about a lot of these value judgments as we kind of move through talking about them in this semester. So again, appraisal just isn't a process that sort of begins and ends. It happens as soon as records are created, and it continues into the future, even after the records are in a repository. So again, in the traditional life cycle of the record, as the Dingwall article from last week talked about, there can be this large gap of time between the retention and disposal choices made by archives and appraisal, or by records creators, and appraisal choices made by archives. And that's really not ideal, again, especially when it comes to digital records. And so, again, that really speaks to the importance of working with a creator and having an understanding of how records were created and used. And this is, something that's important for records managers as well. So, there are a lot of overlaps between records management and appraisal. In both instances, different parties are assigning value to records for whatever reason. And in both instances, both appraisal and records management, it really requires records managers and archivists to know how records are created and used, what they are, the who, what, where, when, and why. And knowing that can allow both archives and records managers to pass on accurate information to researchers in the future, as opposed to a distorted kind of funhouse representation of the past. So, this relationship with records creators is just so important, not only for archivists doing appraisal, but for records managers when they are enforcing and developing retention schedules, and when they are trying to determine which records might be valuable to an organization. So, all right, we will stop there. So yeah, again, we'll talk about the ideas of these kind of reappraisal choices that archivists make as we proceed through the semester. But I hope you have enjoyed learning more about appraisal. Again, it's as much of a science, or as much of an art as a science, unfortunately. But it's just so important that archives carry it out as best they can, and that they are able to support and defend the choices that they make, and that they work with records creators as much as possible in order to convey information to researchers that is going to be accurate and useful. So a very important process, and one that we'll kind of revisit throughout the semester. So obviously, as always, let me know if you have any questions. Thank you, and have a great week.